clicked on this video because you probably have an old Jeep with some ugly old wiring like this. Well, I had the same situation, and what I wound up using was a kit from Easy Wire. This is not an endorsement for Easy Wire. In fact, I found this kit from a local swap meet from a dealer for $165. Fit my budget perfectly. So if you want to see how easy it is to install, well, stick around. Now this is the 12 circuit kit. I went with this kit because this one didn't have all the other things that I didn't need, which was wiring for power windows and dome light, etc. The kit comes with the manual, which, like most men, we're just going to toss that to the side. The wires are color-coded. They match GM, so it also is labeled about every 10 inches on every wire, so that made it a lot easier for doing the install. I was pretty happy with the quality of the kit as well. There's enough wire in here. If you're doing a full-size car, this kit will work out just fine. There was so much wire I wound up cutting out of this. The connectors there, that is for a GM column. So if you were doing something like a street rod and you had a GM column, this kit worked perfect. With it out of the box, let's take a better look here. So this group of wiring is for under the dash for gauges and the like. This is the one that goes to the steering column, so work all your turn signals, hazard, etc. This is all under the hood and to the headlight area. And then the last ring is for the taillight section. I made myself a roadmap of how I wanted to run all my wiring, because some of these things were all grouped together, so some of the wires I needed to split out to run in different directions. I started with removing the dash first. And like any project, broke the first bolt. I started by removing the dash because I needed to make room to install the fuse box and start chasing the wires through the firewall. And I figured the easiest way to do that would be to have this dash out of the way. Also, to rewire the gauges and the like, it would be a lot easier having the dash out and running all those wires. The only issue I had with removing the dash was dealing with the aftermarket gauges. The voltage gauge where it was mounted, the bracket for it was interfering with the upper support. Cleaning the dirt off the firewall, exposing some of the original red paint, and this is the area that I chose to mount the fuse box. I thought it'd be a lot easier rather than having it on the driver's side like we traditionally have a fuse box, that it would be a little bit more accessible here in the center. All I'd have to do in the future would be to lift the passenger seat and remove it, and then just climb in like I am right now to replace any fuses or fix any wires. So now the fun begins, opening up the first group of wires. Now this set is for under the hood. Now with this, I pulled a few of the wires out for the alternator, the exciter wire, the starter wires, and the coil wires, because I wanted to run those through the other side of the firewall, since those items are on the opposite side of the engine. That way I won't have to run them across the front. But also I had pulled some wires from the group for under the dash, and that was for the brake light switch. Because on these old Willys, the brake light switch is on the master cylinder, which is under the floor. I used the new sockets that came in the kit for the headlights, and what I wanted to do next was to work on the front parking lamp. And with the old Jeeps, that really worked only as a turn signal, not as a running light. And so I wanted to modify that to accept a 1157 bulb. That way I would have running lights and turn signals. But first, what I'd have to do is to remove this old socket. I picked up a pair of these from Rock Auto. These are sockets that are designed for replacement in most vehicles from like the late 60s, early 70s, and it accepts the 1157 bulb. Thought the best way to remove this part of the socket was simply just to pull out the old cordless Sawzall and have at it. With that removed, that can go into the trash. Still not quite the right size for that to fit in, so I have more material to remove. Still not quite large enough, and I was going for a tight fit because I want to be able to make sure that that was going to stay in place. So my solution on this was basically just to expand the hole slightly by using 2 sockets. In the end, what I found was on the opposite side, when I did that one, all I needed to do was just grind a little bit more, about another 1/16 of an inch, and that would have been sufficient for that. Now I was going for a tight fit because, one, I don't want the bulb to just simply, or the socket to fall out of the housing, but I also want to be able to remove that in the future, that if I have to replace a bulb, I don't have to remove the glass lens. Then using my battery, I did a test, and I also wanted to determine which wire was controlling the brightness. The taillights I bought at a swap meet also. Now these are just some imported lights. They're not like exact reproduction, but figured they looked pretty darn close and they were affordable. Opening up the light to determine how the back mount was on. Turns out they were just pop riveted in. And also I noticed that the interior of the lamp was painted black, which wouldn't be very reflective. I determined I wanted to mount these lights in the center of that rear panel, but I also had to be careful. You can see where the plug welds are. That is the rear body mount. So I needed to make sure that the mounts weren't going to be, for the light, were going to interfere with that. Now, this replacement lamp does have the option that you can mount the bolts either 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock or 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, which I chose to have it straight up and down. I use a variety of things in my shop for making straight lines, but as you'll see a little bit later, there's a reason why I decided to use a wood block. After making my center line, took some measurements off of the back of the lamp for where the mounting studs would have to go, and then wanted to transfer those marks to the body. Drilled a few pilot holes, and then I came back with a taper bit to make the holes to the size that I needed. Now with the wood block, I am making reference marks for where I had placed those holes so that I could just use that to transfer to the opposite side. Before mounting these lights, then, I decided that I needed to do something about that black interior. So a little bit of masking and a quick change of color. Now you could have painted this white instead of silver, but I had a lot of leftover chrome spray paint. Finally, before mounting the tail lights, I had a few high spots from the plug welds that I wanted to remove. I'm happy with the look. And of course, I had to test. I had to make sure that they were going to work and how bright they would be now that they were painted. Unfortunately, I didn't do a light test before they were painted. On to the headlight switch. Now, this was going to require me to diagnose which plug was doing what, since the way this was mounted in the dash and the wiring that was in here was an absolute mess. What I wound up doing was using a battery, running 12 volts through the switch. I was going to use the voltage meter to probe each of the lugs as I pulled the switch to the two different settings. This is one of those times it's probably best to have a service manual of some kind that would probably diagnose or already show you what each of these lugs went to. But since I didn't have that, I had to go about this method. As you'll see on the first lug, when I pulled the switch, at the first setting it had voltage, and then all the way out it did not. Now this next lug, pulled out at the first setting, nothing, and then all the way out I have voltage. And on the last, I have voltage at both settings. So the one in the back is going to be for the gauge lights, the one in the front is for the headlights, and then this one is for the parking lights. And this last one is an accessory 12 volts, so I'm going to use that for a power outlet. This I thought would be the most challenging part of this wiring. I'm pretty certain that one of the previous owners was going for a new record on how many wires they could put onto one stud. Here again, I needed to do a check to determine the function of the switch. So using my multimeter set to ohms, I decided to check each of the lugs while I turned the key switch in the two different directions. So with this test, I determined that the bottom was the hot coming in. This lug was to activate the coil, and the other lug would be for accessories. Redoing the light sockets, I wanted to remove as much of the old wire as possible and then solder a new wire into it. And then with a little heat shrink tube, seal that up, and then put the socket back together. Did this for each of the lamps, and in the end, what I wound up finding that I did wrong was there's apparently only 2 lights that light the gauge, not 4. The other 2 bulbs turned out to be warning indicator lights. Now knowing what each of the lugs were for, I'm reinstalling the headlight switch. With the wire for the lights, I decided to make the wire a little longer than I needed to and coil it, so that way in the future if I ever have to replace a bulb, as I pull a socket out, there'll be enough wire to allow it to hang below the dash, so that way it'd be a little bit easier to replace the bulb. Hooking a battery up, did a test with the lights, and those are the warning lights that I was talking about, the red and the green. Testing the ignition switch, and it shows voltage at the gauge. And then I also wanted to do a test on the fuel gauge. Not having a working Jeep sending unit, I just used an old GM that I had laying around, which did what I needed to do and proved that the gauge was functioning. Rewiring the old Signal Stat 900, fixing the charging system, and having some success.